This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, we're getting the intel on Catch-22 by Joseph Heller from our guest, Spencer Morrison. Catch-22 takes us back to the dying days of the Second World War and introduces us to Yossarian, a US Air Force bombardier who is stationed on an island off the coast of Italy. Yossarian's traumatic missions are contrasted with his life on the base, which is populated by various oddball airmen who all have their own agendas. They are overseen by commanding officers who are more concerned with abstract bureaucracy and arbitrary rules than the reality of the war. When Yossarian attempts to get out of flying any more missions, he is faced with the most insidious rule of all, Catch-22, which states if an airman flies missions, he is crazy and doesn't have to, but if he doesn't want to fly missions, then he is sane and has to. Joseph Heller was born in Brooklyn in 1923. In 1942, he joined the US Air Force and served as a bombardier on the Italian front, his experiences informing Catch-22. His first published story appeared in Atlantic magazine in 1948, while he was working as a copywriter for an advertising firm. He went on to write 7 novels, a collection of short stories, 3 plays, 3 screenplays, and 2 volumes of autobiography. In the 1970s, he worked alongside Anthony Burgess in the creative writing department at City College, New York. He died in 1999. Spencer Morrison is an assistant professor of English language and culture at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, where he specialises in post-World War II American literature. His writing has been published or is forthcoming in journals such as American Literary History, ELH, American Literature, and Genre. And he's currently completing a book manuscript on 50s and 60s American literature and culture that includes a chapter on Joseph Heller. For all of the relevant links and a list of all the books mentioned, head to the description of this episode. I'm Graham Foster and I spoke to Spencer Morrison about Catch-22 by Joseph Heller in September 2024. Spencer, thanks for joining me on the 99 Novels podcast. Today we're going to talk about Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, one of the more famous books on Burgess's list. We like to start off with just getting a quick précis of the novel. So how would you describe the novel to people who haven't read it?
I think people who haven't read it have likely heard of it, and they probably know it as one of the great comic novels of the 20th century and one of the great war or anti-war novels of the 20th century. And I think I would describe it as, well, a dark comedy or a novel of absurdist humor that on one level is an incredibly impressive feat of comic writing, basically, in the spirit of kind of Abbott and Costello or vaudeville comedy generally. That aspect of the novel has sharp, fast-paced comic dialogue. It has a lot of wordplay, a lot of scenarios based on comic misunderstandings. And that element of the novel, the comedic element, can feel at times like something out of a TV show or as I said, a vaudeville comedy skit, basically. It can feel like a TV show in its quick cuts from character to character and scene to scene. We may discuss this later, but Heller worked in advertising while writing this novel, and he said in interviews that his advertising work, it did shape his approach to storytelling, and there are striking juxtapositions. Heller has this wonderful technique, actually, maybe you noticed it, of using a line in one dialogue as a kind of hinge or pivot into an entirely different dialogue. A character will say a line in response to one character's line in one scene, and suddenly that line will be responded to by a different character in a different scene, and that the reader has the ground kind of pulled out from underneath their feet, basically. And that technique feels to me like straight out of TV. So there's that element of the novel that is, I think, highly unusual in serious fiction. But this is also a really serious literary novel with serious literary aims, and Heller labored over this for many years. And those aims that deal with grave kind of universal themes, those come to the fore in the final maybe 100 pages or so. You probably noticed the sort of shift in tone in the final 100-ish pages. What Heller is skewering throughout, but also showing the tragic harm of, I think, is the military apparatus, this totalizing military apparatus, the state apparatus, and really a sort of military officialdom that surrounds World War II. And Heller juxtaposes, I think, this military officialdom in comic ways, but also in horrific ways, to the brute realities of actual warfare where people actually die. So, yeah, it's a war novel about a war that is filtered through an administrative apparatus where war is really about appearances. And it depicts all sorts of really self-interest and stupid officers who are more concerned with their own career advancement than with actually winning the war or with actually protecting the lives of their soldiers as well. As much as it is a war novel, it's also a novel about a world where kind of administrative reality has subsumed and totally overtaken the reality of combat. I'll say lastly, too, that this is also a novel that's very much about trauma. Beneath the comic patter, this is a novel that's deeply concerned with the very real harms of war, and I think those harms exist at the novel's core. So that it's a novel that works on several different planes. There's the comic and I think the tragic aspects.
You've described the novel really well for a novel that it resists description. It is a dreamlike narrative. It's not a linear narrative. It's a narrative that confuses often.
He plays up that surreal aspect. Before the novel even begins, he has this note at the beginning that says, he's talking about the setting of the novel, and he writes, "The island of Pianosa lies in the Mediterranean Sea, 8 miles south of Elba. It is very small and obviously could not accommodate all of the actions described." Before we even begin the novel, we're being given this admission by the author. This is not anything remotely realistic.
We'd like to know on 99 Novels how you discovered the novel and what you first made of it when you read it for the first time.
I first read this novel probably when I think I was 16. I was in high school, and my parents had this big bookshelf outside my room of their books, and I would just, pluck books off the shelf and read them. And so I read this, and I think I was on a family trip in France, seeing some battle sites, in fact. For me, at that age, it was unlike anything I'd read before. To an extent, I would still say that about this novel. It really is sui generis. I mean, it is a piece of very serious literary fiction which deals with important themes, but it's also comic in a way that is distinct from other comic novels. I see from Burgess's list that he's a big fan of comic fiction, right? You have Lucky Jim there, you have Wise Blood. Those, of course, are fantastic comic novels, but the style of comedy in Catch-22 is something different. Anyway, I put aside that novel for a lot of years after that. And then in graduate school at the University of Toronto, I wound up working on a dissertation that dealt with the encounter between American culture and Europe right after World War II. And this novel seemed to fit.
Yeah, I read it when I was very young and read it again for this podcast a number of years later. And when I was younger, I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the comedy of it, and I enjoyed the certain silliness of it in certain places. But reading it again, you realise how literary the novel is, how carefully constructed it is, and how deep it is as well. It goes beyond the humour, I think.
I think it's easy to get the impression from this novel because it is, as you say, it's silly in places, right? And the characters, most of them are slapstick characters. I think also the characters are basically flat, mostly flat, depthless characters. And we're not talking about a Henry James novel here, or like a Virginia Woolf novel here with James Baldwin or something, where we're plumbing the depths of consciousness. This is something quite different. To me, the aesthetic is out of the movies and television and kind of vaudeville comedy. And so it's easy to get the impression that it doesn't have so-called serious literary influences, etc. Heller he labored for many years to develop this style. He began writing this in 1953, I believe. And he was already a pretty accomplished writer by then. I mean, this was his first novel, but he had published stories in Esquire and the Atlantic Monthly. So, big magazines. And his story in the Atlantic nearly won a big prize among the stories they publish. And he actually published an early version of Catch-22. What is now the first chapter in the novel was published as a short story called Catch-18. It got selected for a magazine called New World Writing it hasn't existed for a long time. But in 50s America was extraordinarily prestigious. If you go back and look at this journal, it publishes early work by who's who of post-war American writers. It publishes early Thomas Pynchon. It publishes Flannery O'Connor, I think Philip Roth, Saul Bellow. Heller's story Catch-18 appears alongside an early version of On the Road by Jack Kerouac as well. So Heller was already a quite accomplished writer when he was doing this, but he labored and labored for years and years and years over this novel, reworked it so many times, and because of the sheer length of time it took to write the novel, he became a little self-conscious, I guess, about how people who were his peers back then, so James Jones, for instance, who's, of course, also a famous World War II novelist, he published a short story at the same time in the Atlantic Monthly as Heller did in 1948. And, of course, James Jones's From Here to Eternity appears much, much earlier than Catch-22. And similarly, On the Road, it appears several years before Catch-22. Joseph Heller felt that he was working so slowly on this. Anyhow, this is a novel that hides, to some extent, its literary influences deliberately. You can see in that scene where Snowden spills his guts, as the novel puts it, in really what is kind of the traumatic core of the novel. The lesson that Yossarian learns from Snowden's death is something along the lines of the spirit gone, man is garbage, I believe is the lesson. And then Heller adds, the ripeness is all. And that line, the ripeness is all, is an allusion to King Lear, for instance. There are allusions to all sorts of writers throughout the text. Yeah, I think there's I'd say a Virginia Woolf allusion at one point. I think there's an allusion to Randall Jarrell. Anyways.
It's fascinating. And you mentioned then James Jones, who was primarily a writer of novels about the Second World War. His most famous was From Here to Eternity, but I think The Thin Red Line has, in the last 20 years or so, surpassed that, perhaps because of the Terence Malick film. The reason I bring it back to that is because Catch-22 is unavoidably a war novel. How does it compare to something like The Thin Red Line by James Jones, which is a very realist war novel?
Yeah, I think Mailer and Jones were the two really prominent models for American World War II novelists, right? And I'd say it's a complex relationship that Catch-22 has to the body of work that comes out of World War II. It's important to keep in mind that Jones's work From Here to Eternity and Naked and the Dead, those appear much sooner after the war than Catch-22. Catch-22, it appears in 1961. So some people have asked, I think it's an interesting question, could a novel like Catch-22 have been a success if it had been published in the 1940s or early 50s. And Heller is satirizing what we still know of as the good war. And it might be that to pull off a satire like this, you need a bit of distance. But I think there are links between Catch-22 and the work of Jones and Mailer, but there are also some differences. Ultimately, I think to me, if I had to slot it alongside major World War II novels, I would place it alongside Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow and Vonnegut's Slaughter Has Spied. Those novels, to me, are a different sort of World War II novel that aren't invested in realism in the way that Jones and Mailer are. But there are important similarities, too, though, between Heller and Mailer and Jones. So maybe I'll just explain a little bit some of those similarities.
Sure.
So those earlier World War II novelists, Jones, Mailer, they're dealing with a theme that I think is also present in Catch-22, which is the mingling, the confrontation between different elements of American society. World War II brings together groups of people from walks of life where they wouldn't encounter one another commonly before. People from different ethnic groups, people from different classes, different regions of the country. That experience of being in the military was, for a lot of people, a kind of testing ground for America's ideals of pluralism. And in Mailer, say, a novel like The Naked and the Dead has a lot of ethnic stereotypes. You have an Italian American character, a Jewish American character, Irish American character. That's not really present in Heller. Right? You don't get those ethnic stereotypes. But you do get, I think, characters from different walks of life and the tensions that arise from those encounters. Yeah, people from radically different backgrounds. That part of the canonical World War II novel is definitely present in Catch-22. And also another thing that I think Heller takes from those major World War II writers is this interest in bureaucracy. And the military is, of course, this vast hierarchical apparatus, right? And this is something that Mailer in The Naked and the Dead is very interested in. He's interested in the suppression of individuality, of the individual will by vast bureaucracies. Very, very obviously in Heller, that's also a theme. Also, I think Heller is drawing on this sense of absurdity, the absurdity of war that you see in earlier writers. Just to take an example from Naked and the Dead, that closing section of Naked and the Dead, where there's a campaign to capture an island, and this small crew is sent around to another part of the island behind Japanese lines to try to attack the Japanese from the rear. And as this small group approaches the Japanese from the rear, they need to scale a mountain. The Japanese are already being beaten by the regular army. And the final 100 pages or so is this fundamentally absurd quest by this commander to have his troops summit this mountain for no good reason, because the war has already been won. It's just useless, futile, purposeless suffering, basically. And Heller's also interested in the war as absurd in many ways and purposeless ultimately. It's worth noting, too, I should say, that there are international inspirations that are probably at least as important for Heller as James Jones or Norman Mailer. So I'd say the two war books that were probably most influential for Heller, those would be Louis Ferdinand Céline's The Journey to the End of the Night and Jaroslav Hasek's The Good Soldier Spec. These are comic war novels, so they gave Heller, I think, a model. Both of these books deal with, well, Céline's deals with a sort of cowardly soldier figure who avoids combat. It's a sort of model for Yossarian. And The Good Soldier Spec it's about this hapless kind of absurd doofus who follows orders religiously. And in following the orders, he reveals the absurdity of the bureaucracy itself. In fact, actually, if people are if they like Catch-22, Heller wrote a sequel to Catch-22 called Closing Time, where in Closing Time, he nods very directly to his influences. And he references both Céline and Hasek in that book.
When I was reading it this time, I very much viewed it as equidistant between something like James Jones and something like Thomas Pynchon. It's right in the middle. It's a stepping stone between one and the other almost, because it's still about the soldiers, as James Jones's novels are. Pynchon's less about soldiers. It's more about the grand narrative of war. Catch-22 is kind of right in the middle. It's got the humour of Pynchon, although it doesn't quite go as far as Pynchon, and it's got the very detailed descriptions of a soldier's daily life and what it's like to be in a war and what it's like to fly planes over enemy territory and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you can see a resonance between Pynchon's sense of paranoia, I guess, and the extreme skepticism and fear of totalizing bureaucratic systems that we see in Catch-22 as well. To me, it's a sort of transitional novel between generations of World War II writing.
We have talked about it being a World War II novel, and it clearly is a World War II novel, but it's also not a World War II novel. Heller inserts anachronisms in the novel. He mentions IBM computers, which weren't around in the 1940s, and he alludes to the McCarthy trials, which were in the 1950s. How do you think this allows us to read the book in different ways?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And the war that it's probably most interested in is the Cold War, or at least as much as World War II. And Heller himself said something like this. He said something like the anti-war energies and the anti-big government energies of the novel come not out of World War II. I'm paraphrasing here. They come not out of World War II, but out of the period after World War II. And Heller was not a pacifist. He said in interviews that he supported America's fighting in World War II. So I think he's invested in very 50s era anxieties about totalizing bureaucracies, a term I think I've used a couple of times before. But this was an anxiety that was characteristic of post-World War II culture. This was the era of famous sociological books like The Lonely Crowd and The Organization Man, all of which were articulating this worry that individuality was under threat, that in an age of mass corporations, in an age of mass entertainment through television, mass consumption, the prospects for creativity, for autonomy were being sapped, basically. It's that stereotype of the organization man who lives in the suburb and drives into his vast corporation. I say his very deliberately because the gendered 50s vision, works in his cubicle at the corporation and returns home and consumes all the same products as everyone else. I think that is very much a concern in the novel. And the organization in which Yossarian's working is this military bureaucracy that feels quasi totalitarian, to use another word that came into prominence in the 50s, right? An organization where it feels like there is no way to resist or escape. I mean, that's fundamentally what Catch-22 as a rule is about. It's this lunatic, paradoxical logic that makes it impossible for anyone to get out of flying combat missions. And the novel is very much about these vast, overweening systems. Also, it's about how or whether to escape from those systems. The ending of the novel, I think, is, to me, one of the most interpretatively difficult parts. It's been read in various ways. Yossarian eventually deserts the army, right? He flees to Sweden. And the chaplain, I believe, at the end of the novel say, it's hopeless. It's hopeless. We cannot change the system that we're in, basically. And that sense that the vast bureaucracies in which Americans are trapped cannot be changed, and the only recourse is escape. That, to a certain extent, I think, describes Yossarian in the novel. He drops out of the military and determines that the best thing to do is not to fight the machine, but to escape the machine. At the end of the novel, Yossarian says, "I'm not running away from my responsibilities. I'm running to them. There's nothing negative about running away to save my life." Some people see Yossarian's escape as actually an affirmation of American values of individualism. Other people see it as something different, as a sort of an abandonment. But I think it's fair to say that that ending to the novel is, I think it's very much in line with the spirit of running away from big totalizing institutions. There's also, I think, an interest in the ills of American power in this novel, and the idea that American institutions can misuse their power. All sorts of intellectuals in the 50s and late 40s, they begin worrying about doctrines of human progress and how human progress can lead to horrifying destinations, basically. All the technology we develop isn't necessarily inherently good, right? And totalizing programs for human progress, like, for instance, communism, that were meant to be liberatory, can be twisted to horrifying ends. There emerges what people call this climate of Cold War liberalism, where all sorts of thinkers are very skeptical of impulses for moral purity and improvement. There's an awareness of human weakness, of selfishness, of fallibility. And I think that's on display in this novel. There are all sorts of Americans who repeat endlessly these slogans that are touting American values, and they repeat them endlessly. But at root, there's a fundamental selfishness that these characters exhibit. Like Milo Minderbinder is a good example of this, where Milo says, "What's good for M&M Enterprises is good for America." Another nod to the Eisenhower era, when you hear that phrase, "What's good for General Motors," I believe, is that what it is good for America. We have a repetition of just like mindless slogans throughout the novel, and Heller is exposing what lies beneath them. That I think is also totally characteristic of this climate of skepticism in unalloyed, pure American leadership in the world, I guess, morally pure leadership.
To take it back to something you said a little earlier on, viewing Catch-22 as a systems novel, the systems novel in America got popular as a sort of theory around the 80s and 90s. So perhaps the most famous example of a systems novel is Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. Viewing Heller as an early systems novel is really interesting because you mentioned as well, not only is the military bureaucracy and a prison, a system that imprisons the soldiers, you mentioned Milo Minderbinder as well, who has created this commercial system within the army. And he's dealing with an import and export business, essentially, but he is doing it completely independently of the army. It's another system that orbits around the system of the army. He gets to the point where he hires Nazi planes to bomb the American airfield because it's good for his company. This, to me, conflicting systems, inescapable systems, systems that weave in and out of each other, is a complete hallmark of those later systems novels, which are about Infinite Jest, for example, is about the system of addiction, the system of sport, weirdly. It's set primarily in a tennis academy. And these systems are interweaving, and it's a very complicated novel, much more complicated than Catch-22, but the genesis of those ideas, I think, is in this novel. I don't know if you had anything to say about that.
I hadn't actually thought of that connection myself, but you're totally right. I mean, I think what I was saying is it does actually position Catch-22 as this kind of proto-systems novel. To me, the big system in Catch-22, but besides the military bureaucracy, to me, ultimately, the big system is language, I think. And there's a way of thinking about this novel that sees it as fundamentally about the mindless repetition of bureaucratic language, and that language being fundamentally divorced from the brute material realities of the battlefield, basically. There's this divide, I think, in the novel between the officer class, the people like Colonel Cathcart in the novel, who live within this world of administrative language in which the war is a pure representation, and the experience of the actual soldiers, like Yossarian, whose lives are at risk. I think this is this disjunct between administrative language and bodily reality, it comes up in a bunch of different ways. So just to give you like a couple of, to me, the most conspicuous examples are when Dr. Nika, the doctor, and Heller plays this for comedy, but it's a grim kind of comedy. He describes how Dr. Nika has his name added to the flight lists of missions so that he can get credit for flying those missions, but he doesn't actually go in the planes. And on one of these missions, the plane, I think, gets shot down, if I recall. The entire crew perishes. Now, Dr. Nika isn't on that flight, right? His name is on the flight roster, but that's all. He's not actually on the plane. But because his name is on the flight roster, the official administrative recording of who is on this flight, Dr. Nika is recorded as being dead. In that scene, though, even as Dr. Nika is being recorded as dead, Dr. Nika is standing right beside the person who's making that recording of Dr. Nika's death, saying, "No, I'm right here. Like I'm still alive." But there's such a trust in administrative language that the bodily reality of Dr. Nika is overlooked. He's recorded as being dead, and that is what effectively becomes reality. You can see this even in more indirect ways. So another fundamental kind of structural aspect of the novel is that we don't see the targets of Yossarian's bombing. We see Italians in Rome who are harmed by the war, but we don't see the targets of Yossarian's bombing. What we do see is Yossarian up in his plane, and early in the novel, Heller describes Yossarian's plane in a way that reminds me of the system of language. He says something like, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something like, the only place to go from one part of a plane is to another part of the plane. It's as if Yossarian, who's trapped in his bombardier's capsule in the plane, which feels to him like a sort of tomb, he is trapped within this structure of the state, the airplane. And from on high, they rain down destruction upon people beneath, whom Yossarian doesn't engage with directly. And that description of the plane as this self-enclosed system that is very reminiscent of language, I think. That to me also captures this really grim juxtaposition that Heller is making throughout the novel between the state-based language-like systems that see war from on high, from 10,000 feet or whatever, and then the actual grim material reality below of death and destruction. And Yossarian, while he's in the plane, is this agent of the state. Even though he's resisting the state, he's still trapped within the aircraft. So the way in which this novel is a systems novel, and it very much anticipates these later postmodernist novels that are about language, is in its treatment of this sort of inescapable linguistic system. And as a final little nod to Catch-22's proto-postmodernism, we see in almost the most literal way possible that statement by Jean Baudrillard that the map precedes the terrain in that scene where Yossarian's group is supposed to bomb Bologna, and it's going to be a very dangerous mission. Everyone's very worried about the mission. And Yossarian simply on the map moves the bomb line further beyond Bologna, making everyone believe that suddenly actually the troops on the ground advanced and they captured Bologna so that no one needs to bomb Bologna anymore. The line on the map being moved becomes the new reality that everyone begins to believe. This is a novel about the repetition of language and people's investment in their belief in the language that they're speaking rather than the world that is actually in front of them.
But there is another kind of system. It's not necessarily related to the plot of the novel, but it's the way the novel is written, the way the novel is structured. It's very odd. It's not structured in a traditional sense. You talked earlier about the main traumatic instigation for Yossarian's rebellion, which is the death of his comrade Snowden in a mission over France. We hear about that not in the first chapter, but very early in the book. It's within the first 50 pages. But you don't hear any more details. He's mentioned every now and again, dotted through the text, but you don't hear the story of Snowden until right at the end of the novel. And all the way through the novel, time shifts, and you never know truly where you are in the sort of linear narrative of the novel. Events happen out of order. It's very dreamlike, as we've mentioned. Even some of the battle scenes, although brutal things are happening in the battle scenes, they seem quite dreamy. And I watched the recent television series where the battle scenes are very, very gruesome. And that didn't fit with my idea of what the novel was. Obviously, the battle scenes are brutal, but the way they're described is very dreamy. So what do you make of this structure of the novel? Why do you think Heller has made this confusing narrative that is not linear and does not go for the same sort of way of describing war that other novels might?
This is a disorienting novel in its structure, like you say. And there are the references to Snowden that accumulate. And with each reference, more and more is disclosed, more details are given. And that happens with a number of parts of the plot, too. It's a novel that gives us references to events and to characters totally out of context. And then only chapters later, sometimes 100 pages later or hundreds of pages later, will actually fill in the details, basically. So it's disorienting in that way. You have to keep in mind these passing references. It's also compared to other war novels. This isn't a novel really with a standard kind of trajectory in the battle either. There isn't like a beginning or end to the battle. We're thrown into the middle of things. I mean, we get the sense that the war is well on the way to being won. That's one of Yossarian's, I guess, reasons for not wanting to fly any more missions. He's flown far more than he was supposed to, but also the war's on its way to being won, and he wants to go home. But it's disorienting also because in terms of time, we don't always know where we are in timing. Sometimes we have to refer to the number of missions that Colonel Cathcart is demanding of the soldiers, and we'll hear that Colonel Cathcart has demanded 60 missions or 65. But then in a different chapter, we'll hear that Colonel Cathcart is demanding 55 missions, which is a signal that we've gone back in time. Or characters who are killed will be alive in a later chapter, so it's also a signal that we've gone back in time. And even the chapter titles can be disorienting, I find, because a lot of the chapters are named for characters, and then those chapters turn out to be about all sorts of other things other than the character who was named in the chapter. Heller got criticized for the structure when this was released. So, like Norman Mailer, who became Heller's friend later on in life, Mailer said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said something like, you could cut 100 pages out of this novel at any point, and no one would know the difference because there wasn't really a plot structure to it. And in the New Yorker, there was a review that wrote something like, Catch-22 is not really a book. It doesn't even seem to have been written. Instead, it gives the impression of having been shouted onto paper. But I do see a purpose to the disorientation and the kind of chaos that confronts readers in this. One way of thinking about the structure, I would say, is that the first 85% of the novel is, to a certain extent, I would say, episodic, by which I mean, if you think about, say, I'm going to date myself with my cultural references, but you think about like Seinfeld, for instance, and how you can pick up Seinfeld at any episode, essentially, and orient yourself within what is going on. You figure out the qualities of a George or a Kramer or an Elaine, whatever. And most of the time, there aren't plot lines that extend across multiple episodes. For the most part, at the end of each episode, you've returned to more or less the state that existed at the beginning of the episode, so that you can pick up at the subsequent episode where you left off. To a certain extent, with Catch-22, for the opening stages of the novel, you probably can plot yourself at the beginning of almost any chapter and orient yourself within the world that Heller's giving us. I mean, to me, like the opening stages are, to a certain extent, an episodic platform for Heller's comedy writing. So there's that way of thinking about it. But I think more fundamentally, all the disorienting aspects of the structure also we can think of as partly serving some of the purposes of his art, I would say. I mean, the disorientation, I think, it captures the chaos and disorientation of soldiers like Yossarian, who are caught up in this vast war, whose scope is so far beyond the comprehension and understanding of any one subject. People who study war and literature often make the point that one of the fundamental tensions in war literature is between the tendency of the novel to be anchored in individual experience, and on the other hand, the reality of war as an event that involves hundreds of thousands, millions of individuals, and that takes place well beyond the scope of individual experience. And so I think the disorienting structure actually does convey some of that experience of war, really. Yeah, it gives us that sense of like confusion, dislocation, basically. And it also, I think, because we were talking about this as a systems novel, a novel that is about bewildering systems that are difficult to comprehend and control, the fact that we are being shunted around in time and we have to locate ourselves, it places us as readers, I think, within this disorienting system of the novel that might mimic, I think, the experience of a soldier like Yossarian within this vast administrative system. This is where I think I would also depart from Mailer's opinion that you can just kind of cut out 100 pages of the novel at random and you wouldn't lose anything. Like you were saying with Snowden, these references to his death, they accumulate in the novel. And Heller, I think, very carefully, very skillfully discloses more and more information with each reference. And that's deliberate. And there's also the slow drip, drip, drip of Yossarian's friends dying. Those deaths accumulate as well. And so I do think this structure of repetition in Snowden's case and the accumulation of death, it serves Heller's purpose of building towards that shift in tone or shift in emphasis from the comic to the tragic or melancholic in the final stages of the novel. I think also the repetition that we see in the novel, it captures to some extent the structure of trauma. This is a novel that is also in a really serious, non-comic way about a traumatized soldier. Yeah, there are a lot of ways to think about the structure as not just, well, I think it's very clearly not just haphazard and chaotic. It's a very deliberate choice on Heller's part. He spent a lot of time arranging the novel like a jigsaw puzzle, basically.
In terms of the construction of the novel, Heller has spoken about the importance of his editor, Robert Gottlieb, who I think the novel was 400 pages longer or something. And Gottlieb helped Heller shape it into what it is now. So it's a very delicately balanced novel, I think. It's a very intricately structured novel, and removing any one part of it, I think, would make the whole thing collapse.
I agree. And Gottlieb was important in that winnowing aspect of the novel. Well, he was important in also championing the novel within Simon and Schuster, the publishing house that first published it. There was skepticism at first. There were people within Simon and Schuster who didn't think it would be a success. And Gottlieb, who was remarkably young, I think he was maybe 26, 27 or something like that, but he already had a lot of clout at the publisher. He was one of its champions. And he was consistently, I think, encouraging Heller to pare down his language, to make the book more direct. But Heller himself, before he, I think, encountered Gottlieb, he also was thinking about this novel as a kind of jigsaw puzzle. So he wrote this novel, as I think I mentioned earlier, he wrote this novel while he had a 9-to-5 job. He worked in advertising, and he worked for big magazines for a lot of the time he was writing this novel. He worked for Time magazine, he worked for Look magazine. And so he only wrote this thing in the evenings and on weekends. And as I understand it, he would often come home from work, sometimes go for a walk with his family to clear his head, and then sit down, and his composition style was very systematic and orderly. He had a whole filing system of index cards, actually, where he would write out character descriptions. He write things about themes, about plot events. And friends of his joked that as he was writing this, he wasn't creating a novel; he was creating a filing system. Actually, this is how he worked. I think Nabokov also worked in this way, incidentally. Who wrote mostly on note cards. So Heller had these note cards that he worked from, and the chapters were often, to a certain extent, standalone pieces. Like that short story, the early fragment of Catch-22 they published called Catch-18 becomes effectively chapter one. Eventually, by the late 50s, when he was working with Gottlieb, he worked on many different drafts at once. So yes, this became this sprawling project. And as I understand it, even at Simon & Schuster, it became this sort of project that was legendary for its sheer complexity and how long it took to write and to organize. So yeah, Gottlieb was important in helping give a shape and structure to the narrative, but also I think to Heller's prose as well.
What do you think Heller's reputation is today? Do you think there is a legacy there? Do you think there are any writers working today that have been influenced by him?
Sadly, I think he's mostly remembered for Catch-22. His second novel, called Something Happened, is very, very good. If people enjoy Catch-22, I'd really urge them to check out Something Happened. A lot of people who read Heller actually think, and I also think, that Something Happened is a more impressive literary feat. I'm more blown away by Something Happened than I am by Catch-22. It is about this miserable, dull organization man character whose life is mostly uneventful. The title Something Happened is ironic because for a lot of the novel, nothing really happens. At the end, something happens. I won't tell you what. But Heller, nevertheless, holds your attention because of the kind of spirit of his prose, basically. I mean, it becomes this exercise in holding the reader's attention despite the subject matter being fundamentally boring and uninteresting, but he pulls it off. So I think Something Happened is a really underrated novel in 20th century American literature. He should be more known for that, I think. So to me, novelists he's inspired very clearly include Vonnegut and Pynchon. I mean, as we were saying earlier, that Catch-22 is, I think, a sort of transitional novel to the sort of work that they do. Heller also, I think, is very clearly an inspiration to Vietnam War writers. People writing about war, of course, and not surprisingly, are influenced by Heller. That link might be a little obvious, but he's also an inspiration to comic writers, I would say, too. And to me, these aren't direct links, but I mean, you think about writers who come after Heller who I think channel the energy of popular forms of comedy, like stand-up, say, into the novel. You know, you think about a Philip Roth in Portnoy's Complaint, or more recently, one of my favorite writers, Paul Beatty, in a novel like The Sellout or The White Boy Shuffle. I mean, Heller helps clear the way for writers of that sort, really. And I'm not suggesting that there's direct inspiration, but I think he inevitably influences those writers.
Still on the subject of novels, this is your chance to recommend a 100th novel to add to Burgess's list. We ask this question to everybody. So if you could add a novel to Burgess's list, what would it be and why?
I'm not a Burgess expert, I will say, but looking at his list, there was one quite surprising omission from the list that to me seems like an obvious addition based on his interests, which would be Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, because clearly Burgess loves comic novels and he's also quite interested in World War II novels. I saw Elizabeth Bowen on the list and Dayton's Bomber, for instance, also. So Slaughterhouse-Five seems like an obvious addition. However, that novel is already so famous and well known that I want to give listeners something a little less obvious. So let me recommend a book from 1947 that is mostly forgotten now. It's a World War II novel called The Gallery by John Horne Burns. And it is one of the great novels of World War II that has now been mostly forgotten. It is formally experimental. It's a story that is told about the Allied occupation of Italy and North Africa near the end of World War II in 1944. And it's told from a variety of perspectives, 9 different characters, all of whom pass through this gallery, this shopping arcade in Naples called the Galleria Umberto. And then Burns intersperses within these different sections what he calls promenade sections, which are kind of like these first-person narrated passages that take place all along the Mediterranean in places where Burns himself served in World War II. It's a very formally ambitious modernist piece of writing that I think Burgess would have enjoyed. And I think one of the reasons it's been forgotten is just that the author died very young. He died at 36. And also, after publishing this novel, which was at the time, it was briefly a big success. Like literary heavyweights like Hemingway and Dos Passos, they praised it really highly. I think he even ended up on the cover of Time magazine alongside people like Mailer and James Jones, the great World War II writers. But he died young, and also the 2 novels he published after The Gallery were colossal failures. They were critically panned. So he's basically fallen into obscurity at this point, but was briefly a revered, celebrated World War II author.
That's a fascinating choice. It's not a novel that I've heard of, so I'm always grateful for people recommending new novels to me, to our listeners. Thank you, Spencer. This has been an amazing conversation about Catch-22. We've gone into quite a lot of detail. I hope our listeners can follow it. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It was a lot of fun. I mean, I love talking about this novel, and so I was glad to have the chance to do so.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. For more information about Anthony Burgess and to support the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. You can subscribe to the Burgess Foundation's free Substack newsletter at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com. The theme music for the 99 Novels podcast is Anthony Burgess's Concerto for Flute, Strings and Piano in D minor, performed by No Dice Collective. Find them online at nodicecollective.com.